Okay, this Thursday, people in Britain will be going to the polls to elect their new government. To discuss this issue, we've today joined by John Rees, who's a prominent UK writer and commentator, and he's also a spokesperson for the anti-austerity group People's Assembly. Thank you for joining us, John.
You're welcome.
The election looks incredibly tight. Do you think this is an important election, and if so, why?
Yeah, I do think it's a very important election, actually, probably the most important election of recent times, because it's not just that who is going to be the next government is at stake. When you take into account what's happened in Scotland, it's whether or not the United Kingdom, which has been in this form since 1707, is going to survive in this state. And also, the rise of the minor parties, but in particular of the Scottish nationalists, has meant that the election is now not just seen as a competition between the establishment parties. There's another voice, an anti-austerity voice, a voice that's opposed to the renewal of the Trident nuclear missile system. That's sort of blown up into the middle of this election. So it's much more interesting than previous elections have been.
And why do you think the SNP is growing so much, and especially in the Labour heartlands?
Well, this is the aftermath of the Scottish referendum last September, of course. Now, that was lost to the Labour Party, but it was lost because Labour allied itself with the Tories, campaigned for the Union, and many hundreds of thousands of Labour voters detested it for doing that. And what's happening now is it's their revenge on the Labour Party for blocking with the Tories and defending the Union in the Scottish referendum. And if the polls are even half correct, Labour's traditional base in Scotland will be all but eradicated in this election. So it's a very significant turning point, because if that happens, it won't just be Labour in Scotland that disappears. The whole question of what is Labour good for south of the border will then become a post-election issue.
And why do you think, what's the main reason is that Labour hasn't been able to take advantage of the fact that Britain has been governed for the last 5 years by two parties in a very unpopular coalition? It's two principal rivals before this election.
It's too close to the other parties. It's that, you know, the British establishment now ranges between a Tory party and a Liberal party that have pushed through the austerity measures of the last 5 years, and a Labour opposition that wants austerity light, that wants to do the same cuts but more slowly. And that's not an attractive ideological opposition for voters. They don't see why they should turn out for a Labour Party which is that close to its opposition. Now, something interesting has happened, though, during the course of the election itself. And that is because of the eruption of the Scottish National Party into the election. It's meant that the traditional parties, rather than pursuing an electoral strategy, which they've all done for 20 years now, of trying to win the middle ground, they've all had to move to shore up their traditional vote. They're not thinking, are we going to get 43% of the vote? They're thinking, we've got to hold on to 35% of the vote. And so Labour's core policies haven't altered. They're still neoliberal economics. They're still the same as the Tories broadly in terms of foreign policy, but they have had to develop a rhetoric which says no, we're not quite as much the same as we've previously been saying we are. So they've been attacking the non-domicile status of rich tax exiles. They've been talking about the possibility of taxing the corporations more. There's been a change in the rhetoric, and that's really given the Labour Party a better election campaign than it would have had previously. Not good enough, but better than it was.
And aside from just this election, what do you think the rise of the SNP says about kind of the breakup of the traditional political system in Britain? We've seen the rise of the Greens as well, and also on the right, unfortunately, the rise of UKIP. Do you think this is a more profound development?
Yes, I think it means that the whole kind of neoliberal foreign policy consensus and the neoliberal economic consensus is breaking up now. I mean, this has been a fact of British political life for a long time now. For 15 years, it's been the case that the vast majority of the electorate, when they're asked in opinion polls, don't agree with more free market policies, don't agree with the foreign wars, but it's had no expression inside the electoral system. Now, in a variety of different ways, it is finding an expression inside the electoral system, albeit in partial and attenuated ways. That's what makes the election interesting. The fact that this long pent-up demand for something different is suddenly finding an expression inside the electoral system.
And do you think that there needs to be, to reflect that in the will of the people, do you think we have to see a change in the political system in Britain? Because the current system is very skewed towards the two main parties.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, one of the things that this election is going to do is it's going to make the constitutional questions much more central to British politics. It's obviously going to make the question of whether or not the Union can survive much more central. The British establishment thought that they'd finished this question with the no vote in the referendum, but it's quite clear that the scale of the Scottish National Party vote, no matter what they're saying now, will raise the question of Scottish independence again. But it's more than that. Proportional representation, I think, will become an issue once again. There are many, many people who are voting for parties that aren't the mainstream parties and wondering why, are unhappy about the fact that their votes don't count. I think it will raise the question, the Tories are already raising the question, of whether or not they're going to have only English MPs voting on English matters. This will raise the question of constitutional reform. There's an entirely corrupt and useless second chamber, the House of Lords in this country. There are now so many lords have now been created that they can't all even sit in the chamber at the same time. So these issues are going to become much more central to British politics, I think, after the election.
Well, thank you very much for that, John Rees.
You're welcome.